We are in the book of Romans, chapter 4 tonight. We will not finish the whole chapter. There's just so much in this that needs to be talked about, and I'm just going to slow down and talk about it. And we'll get through Romans. Are any of you on a time schedule? Okay. So if you'll bow with me for prayer. Our Father, we're so thankful for the day, the blessings we enjoy. This time that we can be together as your family, that we can open your book and we can talk about the great things that you have done, how that you have planned and purposed and brought to pass the coming of your Son, the giving us of forgiveness, adopting us as your children. From the beginning, Father, that you designed in creation, that you would have such a family. We pray, Father, that we can live up to this family name, that we can bring glory and honor into your name. We pray that you would give us wisdom from our study tonight, that we can learn how to please thee. And above all, Father, we pray that you would continue to bless us, be with us, keep us as your congregation here. Help us to be a light in this community. Father, we're thankful for those that have come, and we pray that you would accept us in Jesus' name. Amen. Romans chapter 1, verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is the power of God unto salvation unto everyone that believes, unto the Jew first, and also unto the Greek. That is the primary thrust of the first 8 chapters. And God gave us the good news, the gospel about Jesus being the Son of God. And those that will put their trust in Jesus can find a right relationship with God and forgiveness. And those that don't, Mark 16 says they will be condemned. And so this was the beginning. The problem came as many of the Jewish brethren came into the church. They just had a hard time giving up 1,400 years of history. And they had been God's people from the time of the Exodus up until the time that Jesus came. They had lived under the law of Moses during that whole time. They had had the prophets. They had had the temple. They had seen all of this. And now they were simply having a hard time giving that up. And so when the Gentiles began to come in, the Jewish brethren got a little bit jealous. I don't know what other word to use. And so they began teaching. It's all right if they come in, but they're going to have to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And the Apostle Paul put his foot down and said, no, that is not going to happen. That is not the way this works. And so he introduces us here. It is the gospel that is the power of God to save. And it's the power of God to save all that believe. The Gentiles, yes, but also the Jewish people. And so, verse 18 through 19, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them or among them, for God made it evident to them. And so this is the whole rest of the first chapter. How did the Gentiles do on their own without the law of Moses? And the answer is they blew it. They simply sinned. The rest of that chapter is a downhill story. They got worse and worse. And God let them go and let them go and let them go. But he's going to bring them to judgment on that. Chapter 2, the first 12 verses, basically is that when God stands in judgment, there will be no partiality with God. And that is, the Jews don't get a break just because they're Jews. The Gentiles don't get a break because they're Gentiles. I don't get a break because my daddy is a preacher. My children don't get a break because I am a preacher. What happens is that God's judgment will be absolutely fair, equitable, individual, and complete, and righteous. So what that means is we now take a look, well, how did the Jewish people as a people do? And the answer is, he says, we Jews are no better than they, the Gentiles. No, we've already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. They're condemned unless and until they put their trust in Jesus as the Son of God. That's the gospel message. Then, in chapter 3, verse 19, it says, we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be closed, and the whole world may become accountable to God. The Jewish law was not given to the Gentiles. It was only given to Israel. But what happened with that is, he quotes a whole bunch of verses, and their law says they sinned. There was not a righteous one among them that could stand on his own before God. So, having said all of that, we talked about how we are justified and the right made righteous and the propitiation and forgiveness. All of those big words that we talked about last week. And so now we jump in and we got to change gears. And so the opening verse is, what shall we say then about Abraham? How was Abraham right with God? That's the question. We are, if you were a Jew in the first century, you would have said, we are Abraham's descendants. And what we're going to learn in the rest of chapter 4 is, no, believers in Jesus Christ are Abraham's descendants, both Gentiles and Jews. But they didn't see that at that point. So Paul's just going to back up and get a running start. What do we say about Abraham? How was he right with God? Abraham lived before the law of Moses. Abraham lived around 2000 BC, and Moses was about 1400 BC. And so Abraham lived hundreds of years before there ever was the law of Moses. Now, there was God's revelation of what he wanted them to do, but not in a codified law as we see in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and that. Abraham lived back in the patriarchal period. And so that then gave way to the Mosaical period when God finally gave them the law. And then that gave way to the Christian era as we give these labels to these. These are not biblical labels. They're just our way of trying to identify what we're talking about on that. So as we talk about that, we're going to learn something rather interesting. And that is, Abraham was saved on the basis of trusting God. When you turn to the law, Romans 4 is going to say, this is what David said about it. Blessed is the man whom God will forgive. Blessed is the man whom God will not account unto him his sins, but will account unto him righteousness. And so, under the law of Moses, David said, salvation is again according to a person's trust in God. And then finally, when you turn to the New Testament, guess what? It's not those that had the law that count, but those that have faith, trust, put allegiance in Jesus Christ. And so this has not really changed, but what they were asked to do to show their faith and trust has changed. What Abraham was asked to do is not what Moses and David was asked, and what they were asked to do, you and I are not asked to do. But regardless of whatever God asks, Jeff's response is to trust God implicitly. And Richard and Sharon, that's our relationship with God. So when we talk about this, it is the matter of our trust that allows us to be righteous with God, that allows us to be saved. How many of you realize that saved is one of those words? It's not a personal activity, but it's something that happens to me. I'm saved on the basis of forgiveness. And when that takes place, then and only then am I, who is a sinner, ever going to be right with God. I can't undo my sin. I can't make up for it. And I surely don't want to serve the penalty. What is the penalty for sin? Death. Okay. I don't want to do it. So Romans 4 is going to talk about how we are right with God. And it's going to center primarily upon the story of Abraham. So Abraham lived before the law. In verses 6 through 8, we'll talk about David, who lived under the law. And then starting in verse 9 through 12, we're going to talk about us. And we live after the law. But what did we just learn in the previous chart? Whether it was Abraham or David or you, we're saved on the basis of trust. Now you're going to hear me use the word trust. The problem that we have is we've watered down the word faith to mean basically an acquiescence agreement to a proposition. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay. But now, when you start making change, and it's your business, that's where you put your trust in your belief of mathematics. And the idea of trust, one of the illustrations I heard years and years ago, there was a guy that was doing tightrope walking across between 2 skyscrapers. And he had a wheelbarrow. Now, what they didn't realize is that wheelbarrow helped him keep his balance because he had 2 things up on the line at all times, and he had weight out here on both ends. And so somebody called him on it and said anybody could do that. And he says, I'll tell you what, you get in the wheelbarrow and we'll see. If you trust me. Nobody got in the wheelbarrow. They believed he could do it, but not enough that they were going to do it. That's the difference between belief of a proposition and trust in the person. And so we trust Jesus as being our Savior, our high priest, our sacrifice on this. And so we are going to show that this is actually a law of faith. It's always been God's way of making man right with Him. Abraham, David, and now us on that. So, the life of Abraham, and I don't know whether you've ever done this or not, but Abraham was the head of the house of all of the Israelites, descendants after descendants. He was the father of Israel. Pater means father, and ark means ruler. And so Abraham was the ruler of his house, of his family on that. And he's mentioned by name 217 times in the Old Testament. I didn't count them. I have a Bible program and I said, Abraham, Genesis to Malachi, and it pops up this number. So I got interested. What do we do when we put in Abraham and put Matthew to Revelation? And the answer is 72 times in 69 different verses. It's going to talk about Abraham. How many of you realize how important Abraham really is? The story of Abraham is the story that is God's telling of what He was doing to that. It's going to set before us what God considered to be an example, the example if you want to, of what it means to trust God. And so you begin reading this. And Abraham is said to be the father of the circumcision to those who are not only of the circumcision, but also who follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham. Are you walking in the steps of Abraham? That's what we're going to look at tonight. What would it mean to walk in the steps of Abraham? Wow. Well, let's start. Genesis chapter 11, first time we see Abraham or hear about him, and it says, Terah, Abraham's father, lived 70 years, became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, and these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot, who was thus the nephew to Abraham. And then in chapter 11, Abraham and Nahor took wives for themselves, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, and the daughter of Haran, and the father of Milcah and Eshcah. And Terah then took Abraham his son, and Lot the son of Aaron, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, Abraham's wife, and they went from the Ur of the Chaldees. Does anybody know where that actually is? I didn't put a map on here, but what you need to do is find where the Tigris and Euphrates River come down through the Iraq and Iran and goes down into the Gulf there. And when you get to the bottom and right before you get to the Gulf, that's the Ur of Chaldees. It was a great Babylonian city. We have actually found the Ebla tablets, they call that, almost 3,000 clay tablets that just tell us much about. It was a great city, a rich city, a Gentile city, an ungodly city in the sense of worshiping the God, the one and only God. They were idolaters. In fact, Abraham's father was an idolater. And so as we then meet Abraham, Genesis 12, the Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country, from your relatives, from your father's house, to the land which I will show you." And he makes him some promises. Now, here's where I made a little footnote in my Bible on Genesis. See Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, did what? He obeyed. God said, "Go," and Abraham went. God says, "Come," Abraham comes. That's trust. What would be the first question you would have asked when God said, "Leave your father and mother and I'll show you a country"? Yeah. Do you have a travel brochure on that? Can I Google that and find out what it's going to be like? And God didn't tell him, as far as we know. Here's what I want you to realize something. The very first time that you read about Abraham in the life of Abraham, he's a believer. He come out of a idolatrous Gentile city and country, and we meet him as a believer. Does anybody know when he became a believer? He didn't learn it from his daddy, as far as we know. We have not a clue. All we know is the first time that God says something to him that we have record of, Abraham says, "Yes, sir." Packs his bag and his wife, and he takes off for lands unknown, trusting God. That's trust. That's not belief of a proposition. That's trust in the character of God. So whatever you're going to read about Abraham, you will never read about how he came to be a believer. God never revealed that to us. And so that's going to change how you read chapter 15 and how you read chapter 22. Now, it says that Abraham, when he was called, obeyed, and going out to a place not knowing where he was going. This was trust. Verse 9, the next verse, by faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise. So he went out by promise, and now he's living in this land, and he lives it by trust in God. What does that mean for Abraham to live trusting God? Keep reading. That's verse 6 of chapter 12 of Genesis. He comes and he stops and he built an altar and he worshiped God. Is he a believer? He's more than a believer. He's a truster, is that a word? And a worshiper of God. And then it says, the Lord appeared unto Abraham, verse 7, and said, "To your descendants I'll give you the land." And so he built another altar. And again, he worshiped God. And then in verse 8, he built another altar and he worshiped. And so as we begin seeing this, This is what you're going to see. Chapter 13. He went on his journey from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and there he called on the name of the Lord. In that particular thing, it's a matter of worship, but most Bible students, upon reading that, have said he prayed. He talked with God. He told God his feelings, his story, and he now is trusting God and praying to God. And so then in chapter 13, verse 18, he came to the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built yet another altar. Are y'all keeping track of how many altars he built? I'll tell you what, everywhere he went, if there wasn't one that he'd already built, he built one. Why did they build altars? Sacrifice, and they worshiped through the offering of these sacrifices unto God. So, is Abraham a believer or not? Already a believer. A confident believer. Steadfast. And then chapter 14 and verse 19, he blessed him and said, Melchizedek said this to them, "Blessed be Abraham of God." What does that little "of" mean? Belonging to, possession. Who does Abraham belong to? Already belongs to God. He's a worshiper of God. He built God. He's obeyed God. He trusts God. And so Melchizedek saw him and said, "This is Abraham of God Most High." And then in chapter 15, God responded to Abram, "I am your shield." Wow. These things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." Now, I wanted you to read all of that because most of the time, New Testament people only know Genesis chapter 15 at verse 6 as the starting point of Abraham and his faith. As if chapter 15 at verse 6 is when Abraham became a believer. How many of you realize that's just not true? That is not when he became a believer. We don't know when, but we know he has been now for years, walking with God, talking with God, worshiping God. He is one of God's people. So then in verse 15:6, the father had made a whole bunch of promises to him and took him outside and said, "Now look towards the heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Little problem here. How many children did Abraham have at this point? None. How old is he? Don't really know at this point, but we picked up the story when he was 75. So we've walked down the road. He's 80, 85. I'm 75. Don't tell me I'm going to have kids. That's a whole nother issue. But with Abraham, they lived a little longer than that. And when God made that promise unto Abraham, as old as he was, as old as Sarah was, Abraham believed God. He still trusted. What did he believe? He believed that when God said, "You're going to have all these descendants," it's going to happen. He trusted the very promise that God made. Wow. God appeared. Chapter 11, verse 8, this is a recap. By faith he left his home, he built an altar, he called on the name of the Lord, he built another altar. He is called Abraham of God Most High, and God said, "I am your shield." And it's only then that you get to chapter 15 at verse 6, and talking about Abraham believed God. And he trusted that what God said he would do, God was able to do. Could God give a child to an old man? Could God give a child to an old woman? Could God give a child to a barren woman? Could God keep somebody from having a child? You know, what God's going to do is what God's going to do. What I need to do is trust whatever God says. Don't make it up. Don't think that you're going to have a child when God has not promised it to us. But if God did make that promise, Abraham believed. Not a conversion experience, not when he believed, but a continuation of the faith that he has now had for probably 20, 25 years, walking and worshiping God. This is about not the moment of faith that you become a believer. What we're learning here is if you want to be saved like Abraham, you have to have a life of faith. Not a day, not a month, not a decade, a life of faith. And not about some things, but about everything that God says. I'll tell you what, when I studied this years and years ago, this raised my estimation of Abraham from the idea of he believed something in God, and that's not it. He trusted God. And it continues after chapter 15 into chapter 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Abraham's going to become 100 years old, and then he's going to get older than that. And this whole time, from 75 to whatever years it was, he died. Does anybody remember that? 140 or something like that? 75 to 140. How many years is that, Sean? Very quickly, 75. Okay. What happened here is we get the last half of Abraham's life. And that whole life, he trusts God every day, every step of the way, regardless of what God tells him to do. Hebrews chapter 11. We have the New Testament record of Genesis chapter 22. Now, how many of you just realized I skipped over 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and we get to chapter 22. And now, Abraham and Sarah had a kid. Abram's name has been changed to Abraham. Sarai's name has been changed to Sarah. They now are over 100 years old for Abraham. Probably close to 100 years old for Sarah. This is their one and only child between them that they've ever had. And they've waited and waited and waited and waited. And now God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son, and I want you to go over to that mountain and I want you to sacrifice him to me. What happened? The next morning, he gets up, saddles, and puts the wood on the donkey, and they take off, and they get there. Where's the ram? First trip I made to China, I stayed in a Chinese apartment complex. And the name out on the front was the Hebrew word for it, the Lord will provide. I just find that was kind of interesting. Don't know what it proves, but that was Abraham's absolute faith. The Lord will provide. How? The Lord will provide. When? The Lord will provide. If you were Isaac asking all those questions, that's what you would have gotten. And he gets there, he builds the altar, starts the fire, and then ties his son. You'd have to tie me to keep me on that altar. I don't know whether you all thought about that, but he did. And then at that point, he takes out the sacrificial knife. If you're Isaac, what are you thinking at this point in time? We never know. God didn't tell us that part of the story. But I know what was going through Abraham's. Abraham decided if that's what God wants, God gave us this when we were old and beyond having children. God can either raise him up from the dead or give us another one. That's trust. I don't know what he's going to do, but he's going to make it right. He's not going to cheat me out of this. He's not going to do me dirty on this. He trusted God implicitly. And so God provided. And all of a sudden, there's the ram caught in a bush. And so he lets his son go. You know, we're not told the things you and I would like to know. How traumatized was Isaac over this? Did he ever get counseling? And all of this stuff. And we're just not told any of that stuff. But what we are told that Abraham did this, why? Because he believed. He considered, the last part of that, he considered that God is able to raise people from the dead. If you have read the first 22 chapters of Genesis, how many people had ever been raised from the dead? None. Where did Abraham get that idea? God can do whatever he wants to do. God can give me a child in my old age. God can raise the dead. God provide a ram caught in the thumb. God is able to do. That's the faith that Abraham on that. Now, James also tells this story. In the book of James, he says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son, on the altar? And here's where we hit one of the great debates. Martin Luther, the guy that in Romans 4 translated it, saved by faith only. And he put the word only in there. It's not in there. But he put that in there. So when he came to James, he said, that is an epistle of straw. That is not worthy of even being read.
I grew up as a Lutheran and went through a confirmation when I was 14. And then Martin Luther King, or at least the way they taught us, the just shall live by faith.
Oh, that's quoting Scripture.
It didn't say only.
That may be so, but when he translated the Romans 4 into his book, he did put the word only. So that's just a matter of historical record. Now, I'm going to stand and tell you something about Martin Luther, though. When he talked about faith, he was talking about this. He was not talking about believing a proposition. So I understand what he was trying to accomplish. It's just that the people after him didn't understand it that way. And so, was not Abraham offered or justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? Now, what does it mean to be justified? To be right, to be made righteous. What happened in chapter 15? He was made right. Wait a minute. How many times can you be made right? My answer is, I have no idea. Daily? Hourly? Half-hourly? Every time God asks you to do something, you trust Him. And your faith is reckoned unto righteousness. Now, you have to have this type of faith. And this type of faith will be put to your account, it was a terminology used in bookkeeping, would be put to your account, resulting in, that's the little word unto righteousness. So, your faith, when you have Abraham's faith, is put to your account, resulting in becoming righteous. Now, how does it result in you being righteous? You are forgiven. I don't know how to make it any simpler, but people have made it difficult, and I'm just going to tell you. It is not Jesus' faith, it's my faith that is counted unto me, resulting in me being right with God. Don's faith is attributed unto Don, and that results in Don being righteous. Now, some people have tried to say this is the faith of Jesus. And I'm going, no, his faith in this is Abraham's faith. And it's our faith that is reckoned unto our being righteous with God. James went on. At that point, the scripture was fulfilled, which says Abraham believed God. Now, wait a minute. Chapter 15, did Abraham believe God or not? Do y'all remember what it said? He believed God. Oh, okay. But now, what you're seeing is, this is not a one-time faith. This is not a faith event. This is a character of life. This is the very nature of Abraham's relationship with God. I trust God. If God says go, I go. If He says I'm going to have a child, I'm going to have a child. If He says put your child to death, God will provide the proper sacrifice. I trust God. And thus it fulfilled the scripture that says Abraham believed God. Wow. And it was reckoned unto him unto righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. Summary. I'm just going to pick the three big ones. God says, come and I'll show you a country, and Abraham goes. God says, I'm going to make your posterity to be like the stars of the heavens. And Abraham believed God. And then, you need to sacrifice your son unto me. Where would you have bailed at this point?
There was no scripture, right? There's nothing written yet.
No. Moses wrote the history of Abraham, so that comes years and years. Yeah. Yeah.
So that makes it to me.
But I'm going to tell you, here's an interesting thing. Those old countries and those old peoples, they told stories. And if you were going to be one of the storytellers among your people, you had to listen to the story so many times. How many of you read books to your children? How many of your children always wanted the same book? How many of you got tired of reading the same book? How many of you started throwing in little things just to see if they were paying attention? And they would catch you every time. Well, this is what happened, that they could tell. Has anybody here ever read the Iliad and the Odyssey? You've read the whole thing? They had memorized it. We didn't have a written copy of that for generations and generations. What they did was they memorized it. Now, I didn't think this was possible, but I read this story several times. Y'all remember Khrushchev? Okay. Took his shoe off and pounded, we're going to bury you. And as a boy, he grew up across from this Roman Orthodox church, Russian Orthodox church, and he had a bunch of boys who were playing out in the sandlot. And when they came off the field, supposedly the priest, the bishop of the Russian Orthodox, he took them aside and he said, now, here, if you'll all memorize this verse, whoever memorizes it, I'm going to give a piece of candy tomorrow. And so Khrushchev memorized and got his candy, and he memorized the next day and he got his candy, until finally the story is he had memorized the whole New Testament. Wow. Can it be done? Not in today's culture. Our attendance span is 5 minutes. But back in those days, this is what they did. When Don was growing up and he went down here to the malt shop, and a whole table of kids would high school come in after the game, and they would all sit, and the waiter would come up Don, you can correct me if you never saw this, but the waiter would come up and take all of their orders, never write anything down, and go back and tell the cook, and come out and would have it all correct. You can't get them to write it down and get your order correct anymore. Why not? We're not a storytelling people, but they were at that point in time. So this was a life of absolute trust and faith on that. He was God's friend. He walked with God. He obeyed God. In chapter 15, God promised him his offspring when he didn't have any children. It's going to be the stars, the number. Interesting. How many stars are there? I read that the ancient Greeks said 3,427. Now we recognize it's millions and millions and millions. We don't know. But what God's point is you're going to have children. And he believed God. And then put your child to death. And he offered, as good as offered. If God had not stopped him, what do you think Abraham would have done? Now, I'm going to ask you just kind of a silly question in one sense. If God had told Abraham to be baptized, what do you all think Abraham would have done? I have asked that question over and over and over again when I have Bible studies with people. And we'll study the life of Abraham. And you're supposed to have the same type of faith as Abraham did. And if God told Abraham to be baptized, if you have the faith of Abraham, whatever God asks you to do, you set out to do it to the best of your ability. You may be hampered. You may only get halfway there before somebody derails your plans, but you set out to do exactly what God has said. Now, over in Galatians chapter 3, talking about how we're no longer under the law, and that is that now that faith has come, and here the faith is talking about God's revelation of how we ought to live, the faith which is preached. Now that faith has come, we're no longer under the tutor. The law was our schoolmaster or tutor to bring us to Jesus. But now Jesus has come, we're no longer under what? This is another question I ask oftentimes. That is, if the law was our tutor and we're no longer under the tutor, we're no longer under the law. Okay, that's what it says. For, what does that word mean? Because of, for this reason. For, you were all sons of God, how? Through faith in Christ Jesus. For, exactly the same word. Why are we not under the law? Because we're children of God by faith. Why are we children of God by faith? For, as many as have been baptized into Christ, have clothed themselves with Christ. And if you belong to Christ, how do I know if I belong to Christ? You were baptized because Jesus said, he that believeth and is baptized shall be. And so, if you belong to Christ, then you are what? Abraham's descendant. I'm not a Jew. I'm not an ethnic Jew. I am a descendant, a child of Abraham. Gentiles are children of Abraham if we believe. Jewish people are children of Abraham only if they believe. They're ethnically so, but religiously not. Do y'all remember what John the Baptist said when the Pharisees were coming out unto him? He said, don't say that we're children of Abraham. If God wanted to, He could raise up these stones to be children of Abraham. Okay, interesting. So just being born a Jew did not make one a child of Abraham in the sense of a descendant, a person that lives like Abraham. So we are then Abraham's descendants, heirs according to the promise. And so if I was preaching this, I would conclude this by asking, are you Abraham's seed? Since it's not that really, I'm just going to ask you, do you look at your life of faith as being like Abraham? There's been some years, last year was one of those, where bad things happen. Wow. Does that mean God's not providing? Does that mean God is not being faithful to me? Does that? And the answer is no. Doesn't mean any of that. It means bad things happen. This world's a mess. Did you all know that? It has been ever since Adam and Eve decided to follow Satan instead of God. And it's just been a mess. And it's been downhill. But through Jesus Christ, we have the promise of being right with God and the promise of living with God forever in His presence. I can't wait. Just want it to happen. Thank you.